Hello and welcome to this edition of Writer's Mosaic, Common World. With me are two award-winning authors, Kamila Shamsie, the British-Pakistani writer whose 7 books include the award-winning Home Fire and Burnt Shadows, and the South African-British novelist and playwright Gillian Slovo, whose work includes Red Dust and 10 Days, as well as several verbatim plays and Every Secret Thing, My Family, My Country, a memoir. I want to start with the idea of unbelonging. In his piece, Romesh Gunasekera's character says, "I wanted to find the thread that connected us to a place or an idea or a community." Gillian, how do you go about exploring or finding the threads that connect us?
I suspect that I'm interested in the ruptures of those threads, and I partly think that because the threads have been broken since I moved country when I was a kid and ended up, in many ways familiar in both 2 countries and a stranger in both of them. So, yes, I think I look back to the threads in order to find the rupture. And in a kind of a way, I think he is doing that as well, except in a very brilliant, short amount of time. He both showed the rupture and showed what that story meant. I was really impressed by that story.
Kamila?
I suspect in the countries Gillian and I grew up in, the thread is rupture. Right? I mean, that's the binding thing. But I very much agree with that idea of looking back at the difficult places, the places where things get broken. And I love the story as well. But I think one of the things that is interesting to me in my own work and therefore also in the work of other people is that relationship to place as people move away from it in time. Which is to say, when you're 5 years out of a place, I think that place is much more a sort of fixation for you. And maybe 20 years later, the place you've moved to might become a greater subject of interest. I mean, with my own writing, the first few novels were all set in Karachi, and I thought this is where the writing is always going to be. And then 10 years after moving to Britain, I found myself writing this novel, Home Fire, set in London.
Do you think that's because you changed or because the 2 countries changed?
I think it's because my sense of relationship to the place has changed. I mean, yeah, the 2 countries changed, but they'd always been changing. And Pakistan is a country that's been through so many dramatic changes in my lifetime that, again, that is part of the thread, is this idea of shifts. But I think that I had been in London long enough to think of myself as an insider to it and to feel implicated in it. I think that word implicated is sort of one that is interesting to me in terms of place. I don't know, Gillian, do you feel implicated in Britain in the way you do in South Africa, or do you feel implicated in South Africa still after all these years?
I feel both implicated in both and not entirely implicated in either. And I think that is, so many people have now the experience of moving from one country to another. Some people for more than 2 countries in their lives. And I think that is the experience of that migration, is that you are familiar with, very intimate with more than one place and also a stranger in both of them. I think it's partly what Monique Roffey talks about in relation to her story of being a hybrid and, of going to Trinidad and not being entirely fitting in, but having to calm down her accent when she's in Britain. But for me, I think what happened since I come from South Africa is that the country I used to write about no longer exists because of the huge political change that happened after 1994 and the first democratic election. And I am less able to write about that country now because, having been pickled by apartheid in a kind of aspect that meant that I could write from away from it and still be writing about a real country, now the changes are so dramatic that I would have to go and live there again to be able to convince myself that I can write as a non-stranger into that country. And I think that is a strange thing that can happen to a writer, is that the thing that fueled your writing roots, the thing that fueled your imagination, is a story.
Do you think do you see it as a gift, which is what Monique is saying?
I see it as a gift as a writer to have, well, first of all, to have more than one proper, solid experience of how it is to live in a country and what that country's like. And, it's a pain in other ways. It's not,
Yeah, I also think that duality that Monique speaks of belongs to places, but in some ways that is the natural habitat of the writer. I think sometimes too much is made of this distinction between the writers who stay and the writers who move away, because the nature of a writer is that you have to inhabit that duality insofar as you are always both observer and participant. I think that is the fundamental duality. And physically moving away, of course, sort of exacerbates that or enhances it. But I think it's always there. And I always get a little worried when I hear the conversations that make this great dividing line between writers of one place and writers of more than one place. I suspect it's not necessarily as vast a difference or as vast a gap, because some of the best writers are those who can be located in one place and then can have that sort of eagle-eye vision where they are just kind of roving far above it.
No, I completely agree. And I think the great thing about being a writer of fiction is you're allowed to make up worlds. And they're not necessarily about what reality is in this part of a continent or in that part of a continent, but they are about what it is to be human in those worlds.
But I mean, I suppose part of what Monique is also saying, though, is that it means that there are so many different kinds of stories you feel invested in if you're living in different places. I think that certainly is true as well, that, what is around you, kind of the sights and sounds that you're intimately familiar with, after a while belong to more than one place.
Which I think she put rather well by saying it's like being a fish out of water, which I think is great. But then Jacob Ross is quite interesting because he's talking about somebody who doesn't speak and who only writes. And, what that does, because partly what moving, I think, does is it makes you an outsider, and that's good for a writer because it's good to be able to observe from far. But somebody who doesn't speak is your ultimate observer, really, who's, keeping their thoughts to themselves and watching other people and how they are.
Jacobs is mentions set in a prize setting, as with your hats on as former chairs of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, where you read a huge number of pieces from places where people find it quite hard to get their stories out simply because there is no local infrastructure in many places like small island states or certain countries in Africa and many others. How does what you're talking about in terms of being a fish out of two waters, or the observer, the sort of living on the edge of the village, or whatever you want to call it, how does that sit, do you think, with a writer who is effectively stuck somewhere, who isn't moving around but wants to get a wider readership?
Well, I think, unfortunately, I'm going to add this, unfortunate. Prizes is one way of doing it. I think the Commonwealth Short Story Prize is one way of drawing to a wider audience people who are writing. But I don't think that's the solution. And, of course, only one person can win a prize and only 6 people can be shortlisted for a particular prize. Or is it more than that for the short story? I can't remember. And I know that the market here has got a great eagerness for those kind of voices. But I don't think that's a solution. And I suppose, in a way, you have to talk about helping the publishing industry in those countries, finding a way of an outlet for what is often wonderful writing, but, just doesn't have anywhere to sell it. And I think that's a tremendous misfortune. I mean, the other thing about it is that, and I think this was true for a long time in South Africa, for example, is that in countries where people are struggling harder for a living, you get a lot of short story writers, and you get less novelists. And in a way, the world market is more interested in novelists than short story writers. And it's, I think, about also finding a way to buy writers time to be able to do what it what is required to write a novel, which is such a long-term project. Well, it certainly is for me.
But one thing to do, of course, is to look at who are the gatekeepers and have the gatekeepers always belong to one kind of demographic. And if so, what do we do about that? That's one thing to do. But the other thing is, of course, that nothing replicates or makes up for the strength of a local publishing industry. I know that from Pakistan, where the English language publishing industry virtually doesn't exist. And for years, Pakistani writers working in English would go to India and be published there. And it did a lot of good for Pakistani writing. Now, because of politics, that's not happening anymore. The books aren't getting across the border. And so you have to have local initiatives. Part of what can be done if you belong to one of the more privileged centres of publishing is to find the local initiatives and see what you can do with them. But the larger problems of a publishing infrastructure is a very deep-rooted one, and one that probably has to be solved in country.
Yes, like Cassava Republic and all the smaller publishers that are coming out of countries in Africa particularly, which sort of raises also the question about language. So this year, the Commonwealth Short Story Prize is receiving submissions in 11 different languages, local languages, which I believe is a very good thing, so that you don't necessarily have to write in English. Where does language sit in the sort of new world of local publishing infrastructures? How and English in that, given that all the pieces that we've read are English driven. I suppose we'll have English readers.
I mean, I think the problem for local publishers is that if you can't just talk about language, you have to talk about literacy. You know, if you, for example, are talking about South Africa and writing in languages that are not English, that the publishing industry doesn't normally find, you also need to find out, one, the publishing industry has to make a big effort to find those books, but two, you have to have a population that speaks those languages and can read those languages, which can be a problem.
There is a big issue around English. It is one of those legacies of colonialism. It is in many countries, including Pakistan. It's the language of privilege. It's the language of the elite. It's the language of a very small minority. More people now speak it and can read it at a sort of functional level. But the kind of reading you need, the kind of level you need to write in it or to be reading literary fiction is beyond the reach of most people. If you're a writer being published in English, you just have access to so much more in terms of financial opportunities, in terms of publishing opportunities, in terms of prizes, in terms of all kinds of things. And there's huge and understandable resentment about that. And I don't think we should shy away from that. And even, I think it's wonderful that there are writing prizes that are now open to many different languages, but there still comes a point where you need to have a judging process, and you still have judges who, maybe some of them are bilingual, maybe some of them are trilingual, but to find a group of judges who can read all 11 languages. I mean, you always have to try and find ways, but there will come a point where there are stumbling blocks. And again, this is one of those very large infrastructure, empire leftover problems that, we can't expect any prize to solve. So, yes, it's wonderful that many different languages are being brought in, but the larger issue is the position of English itself, and that is a rather intractable problem at the moment, I think.
What do you think? I mean, we've called this edition Common World rather than Commonwealth because Commonwealth comes with so much baggage. Do you think it's possible to talk about a common world at the moment with your writer self and your writer self? I mean,
well, with my writer self, certainly, in as much as if you are a reader, you want to read around the world. That doesn't mean, we're not sort of sitting in a corner chanting, it's a small world after all. I don't think common world has to mean something sort of, soft and hazy. But it is an acknowledgement that we are living in a common world. The climate crisis, if anything, should be drawing our attention to the fact of that common world, which is being decimated at the moment. So yes, there is a common world. And one of the things that we have in common at the moment is a lot of divisions. But, literature has always existed through those moments and in those moments and around those moments.
I agree, and I also think that the problem with common world is it obscures the huge differences between people in our world that we hold in common. Huge differences in capacity, huge difference in resources, in ways of life. And that is why I think it's so important to get stories from other places, because they're the ones that can lead us to understand what life is like there. Yes, we can sit here and we can write about it and we can imagine those worlds, but also it's not the same as that authentic voice of what it is to live in certain places. So, yes, you see, for me, Commonwealth comes with a lot of history and political understanding of what the Commonwealth is. I have a certain attitude to the Commonwealth, and after all, I was born in a Commonwealth country that then left and since has returned. And Commonwealth, in a way, for me, obscures some of the differences between the ways that people in our world are living. And I think Kamila's quite right. It's totally been exposed by the climate crisis. I mean, you know, we've been spent this winter looking at in horror with what has happened in Australia, but we haven't really looked at the tremendous fires that have gone across Africa. And, you know, the fact that bits of Senegal are sinking into the sea. You know, that shows to me how, in a way, it isn't a common world, because we know about the poor people who have run away from their houses because of bushfires, and they are, you know, it's terrible what's happened to them. We don't really know about those other people.
Is that a rupture that you are looking at in your own work? Because it's not an area that you, I don't believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that either of you, that has come up in your work, the climate change. Is it something that interests you, that goes to your heart enough for that?
It's interesting, I'm at the start of a new novel, and I never quite know where the ending is, but I suspect it'll be hard to write about. I know it ends now, and I'm not sure how you can write about now without that coming in. So, you know, I think in some way or the other, it's inevitable that this novel is going to move in that direction. And it's interesting that, you know, the last book I wrote, which was published in 2017, I didn't feel that. But now and I remember sitting and talking to friends saying, you know, in the final section will be now, and she just looked at me and said, climate change. And I said, yes, that it is sort of inevitably how you sort of feel about the moment right now.
And for me, I'm conscious of it in my work, but in a very indirect way, because at the moment I'm working on a verbatim play on the fire at Grenfell Tower. And of course, that cladding which burnt those people up, ostensible reason for it was that it stops tower blocks giving out heat, that it is more green, that it is about trying to get, you know, to 2050 or 2020 or wherever they're trying to get, where we will already be underwater, or most of the world will be, you know, trying to improve that. So yes, I think it must inevitably run through every writer's mind at this point, because, you know, as many climate activists say, this is not something that is about to happen. This is something that is happening now. And what do writers write about except what is happening now?
Just to go back a bit possibly, but Kamila, can you just explain your fast bowler effect?
My fast bowler effect. I think I wrote about this around 2008 or so, when I was asked to do an article on Pakistani writing in English. And there was a period of about 18 months when 5 novels came out. There was Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Nadeem Aslam's The Blind Man's Garden, Muhammad Hanif's A Case of Exploding Mangoes, My Burnt Shadows, and not a novel but short stories, Daniel Moinuddin's In Other Rooms, Other Wonders. And all 5 of them got a certain kind of attention, and everyone was talking about Pakistani writing. And the fast bowler effect is that when I was growing up in Pakistan, Imran Khan was sort of, you know, the great cricketer, and all young cricketers wanted to bowl like that. And then came Wasim Akram, who was also and then there were 2 of them. And then really everyone was, you know, it wasn't, are you a fast bowler or not? It's, are you Imran or are you Wasim? And And so the fast bowler effect was about the way that with Pakistan you had from one or two fast bowlers, suddenly everyone wanted to do that, and you had this almost factory line of amazing fast bowlers coming through the country. And decided that with novelists as well, when I was growing up, Babsi Sitha was the only Pakistani writer we knew of being published in English. And she seemed like an exception because she was one. Around the time my first book was published, which was 98, end of 98, Mohsin Hamid's first book came out around the same time as well. And Nadeem Aslam had one not so long ago, and Amir Hussain had a book of short stories. And suddenly we became aware that something was shifting. And now when I go to Karachi, it's quite amazing because there are creative writing programs at universities. People are studying all of us at universities. And it's quite common now to run into people who are planning to do an MFA, who are working on a novel, who are entering short story competitions. And there's this way in which, it had, in the last generation, you've seen such a dramatic change in the number of writers that are coming out. Having said that, the flip side of that is that idea that that 10 years ago that there was going to be this huge proliferation of Pakistani writers on the world stage hasn't happened in that way. I mean, those 5 writers are still most of whom you talk about if you talk about Pakistani Anglophone fiction. Even though they're more writers, because they're dependent on international markets, and the international market isn't interested in having dozens and dozens of Pakistani writers, there's a blockage.
It sort of interests me because as you're talking, I'm thinking about Russian literature, which at one point was so much on the world stage during the Soviet Union time, and resistance literature, what's happened to it since then. And then I think about South African literature, which at a certain point was only white South African literature that we knew about, but we had Nobel Prize winners, we had Coetzee, we had Nadine Gordimer, we had Andre Brink, and since the political change, you don't know so much what South African literature is. And I think it's about the concentration on the world, on what's important. Apartheid was important. If you're writing about it, then you get attention. Now it's more complicated, much better, actually, for a novelist that it's complicated. Much better you would think, to produce better novels, but sometimes it's hard to write fiction into certain circumstances. So I suppose I'm saying the fact that Pakistan doesn't manage to move out of the mayhem of political disorganization or political strife probably is quite good for writers in that way. Not that South Africa doesn't have political strife, actually, but I do think it's kind of interesting when thinking about the fast bowlers, when the balls change or something. I can't make the cricket analogy here, I can't do it because I don't know enough about
when you change
cricket.
From Kookaburra to a duke,
Yes,
let's say. Yes.
Fine. Yeah. When you change what it does to the sense of what can be written about.
Mm-hmm. Surely we need a fast bowler effect on the local publishing infrastructure, don't we? Which hasn't really happened, or it's a very slow. It's the slow bowler effect,
yeah.
or whatever.
It hasn't happened, and see, the thing is, I don't know that those wonderful new writers aren't writing books. I just know they aren't being published here and in America. And that is, to be reliant on a different market, because the truth is also that 10 or 12 years ago, when there was all that excitement with Pakistani writers, was also a moment when the world was much more interested in news from Pakistan. So these things are related. I think it's much harder right now if you're a writer out of Pakistan to get noticed here. So there are all these problems, and again, it goes back to you need the local publishing infrastructure, but then it's not just about the publishing infrastructure, it's also about what can be said within certain countries and what will be published within certain countries.
Digitalization, how does that add another dimension to?
I really don't know what it's done to fiction. What I do know is that with the challenge to journalism that most newspapers are experiencing, there is a new generation come out, my daughter's generation, which really looks online for long-form journalism, for the kind of thing we used to get in newspapers. But I don't know what it's done with fiction. I don't know how easy it is to, I suppose short-form fiction may be, but long-form fiction, I don't know how easy it is how easy that spread is. Do you know?
No, I think, the novel hasn't been changed by digitalization the way that journalism has, but of course access has. So in Pakistan, for instance, you may not be near a bookshop that will receive novels from different parts of the world, but if you can afford a certain kind of device, you can download books, and so that aspect is certainly very much there. But I think as novelists we do feel the consequences of digitalization less than people in a lot of other mediums. It is one of the interesting things, of course, that a few years ago e-books were going to make the print book dead, and we're going to kill the print book. And then it turned out that they just plateaued, and that people really seemed to want physical copies of a book. And part of what happened, of course, was publishers started producing books that people wanted more. But it is interesting the way the novel still seems to be a tactile entity in a different way, and it's not a generational thing. We did think at a certain point that everyone born after, say, 1990 would want to read their books in digital form, and it seems not to be the case. And partly because the one area where the physical book is most loved is children's books. And so from a very early age, I think we're still taught that the book is a tactile object and it's full of things you want to look at and hold.
What changes have you observed in the sort of genesis of short-form fiction?
The novel is more my space than the short story, so I don't put myself as an authority in this, but I was very struck earlier this year when I was reading sort of shortlisted entries for this competition in Pakistan. It's only open to women. But I was struck by the way in which they were writing about subjects that 10, 15 years ago would have been fairly taboo, and talking about sex and sexuality and patriarchy and things in a way that really did take me aback. Because I thought even, I used to, about 10 or 15 years ago, do quite a few creative writing competitions and workshops in Pakistan, and you had nothing like this, or very little like this. And I remember one of my students had written a short story in which there was the most minor sort of reference to sexuality in a way. And her family read it and told her that, this story must never be seen by anyone, and she was so upset by the whole thing. Today, there does seem to be a different kind of voice and confidence that is coming out around these subjects. I suspect Pakistan isn't the only place of which this is true.
And one of the things that I have noticed is the increase of related short stories that are not a novel but connected short stories that are coming up. And I think that might be a way of helping solve the problems of how much intensity you need to produce a whole novel, that a short story in some ways, not to me who doesn't write short stories, but somehow can seem easier on time and easier on commitment. But that if you then write short stories that are related to each other, you effectively have what is a fractured novel. And maybe that is very appropriate for the fractured world that we're living in.
Well, perhaps that's a hopeful moment on which to end. Thank you very much, Gillian Slovo and Kamila Shamsie.